VM Investments and the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce now present Post-Budget Forum 2022.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the VMIL Post-Budget Forum 2022, being held in collaboration with the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce. Special welcome to our panelists, Dr. Damien King. Dr. King is the Executive Director of the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, and Professor Anthony Harriott, who is a board member for the VM Foundation, Professor of Political Sociology, and former Director of the Institute of Criminal Justice and Security, University of the West Indies. Welcome also to our moderator for this evening, Mrs. Emily Shields, attorney at law and talk show host. I also have the distinction of welcoming two presidents. Firstly, President of the VM Group, Mr. Courtney Campbell, and President of the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Ian Neater. Gentlemen, welcome. I'm looking forward, as I know those who have joined us virtually are as well, to the insightful contribution of our panelists. The VM Group is strident in its efforts to provide financial education because we care and because we know that this fosters empowerment and greater inclusion. Simply put, this is why we are here this evening. Dr. King will assist us in better understanding Jamaica's short and medium-term economic outlook, and Professor Harriott will consider the Jamaican crime conundrum, the seemingly intractable problem that continues to plague us. Friends, this forum is an important annual event for VM Investments Limited. This time around, I am particularly pleased that as we consider the finances, we'll also be interrogating the challenge of crime and the problem it poses to us as a people. There can, after all, be no meaningful discussion on our economy without a parallel discourse on crime. But there surely needs to be more than a discussion, more than academic considerations that would have embarked on over the years. While critical to the process of finally presenting a solution, we must build on the talk and all the research that have been done, all the policy papers, all the green papers, and move purposefully into action. Failing this, we will remain in the perennial state of contemplation while our people cower and our economy underperforms. Over the years, there have been numerous studies, too numerous to mention, and reports compiled on the effects of crime and violence in Jamaica. Indeed, our panelists may have been significant contributors in this regard. It's clear why, given the threat to our lives and the life of our loved ones, we all know that crime has a significant negative impact on our GDP. Numerous studies that would have shown its effect on our collective psyche, while more difficult to measure, is undeniable and destructive. Friends, this year, Jamaica marks 60 years as an independent nation, and we have conquered many challenges. I believe it is within our collective capacity to finally tame the crime monster. A couple years ago, 30 years ago, if you asked me, would interest rates be below 2% in Jamaica, nobody would have taken that bet. But through collective effort of all of us, we solved that problem. We all have a role to play, of course, and I urge each and every one of us to reimagine the impact that we can have in this crime reduction strategies. In the same way that VM must consider our role, I encourage and call on all associations to tackle the problem in a similar manner. It is my view that at a corporate level, we can have a real and profound impact on crime, but My challenge is that we need to recraft our CSR policies. We need to recraft our ESG framework, more targeted to crime reduction. We must identify ourselves as critical stakeholders, but truth is we are all stakeholders. Every Jamaican has a role to play in this battle, and truly accepting this is a critical step to a solution. I think I want to reiterate that personal responsibility. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a lot of work to do, and our gathering today is a significant part of that effort. My hope, my prayer is that the ideas generated and shared will gain momentum towards a meaningful reduction in crime. I do believe that every single Jamaican, the 3 million here, the 3 million persons outside, are aligned in that regard. Yesterday, the Minister of Finance gave a speech, and I'm going to quote from his speech yesterday. He said, "We must have the vision and we must have the courage." I want to leave it there. We must have the vision, we must have the courage, we must take the personal responsibility, we must use the platforms that we hold for impact on crime. Jamaica needs it. With that said, I now invite the President of the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Ian Neto, to share a few words.
Thank you, CEO Burgenson. Madam Moderator, distinguished speakers and listeners, on behalf of the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce, I want to note how pleased we are that once again the Victoria Mutual Group and us are partnering to make this post-budget forum possible. I believe that we stand to learn much from the perspective of our key speakers this afternoon, and I, for one, will be listening closely. I know our presenters will be looking closely at yesterday's presentation by the Honourable Minister of Finance and Public Service, so I will offer only passing comments on the content of his remarks. I must say, though, that it is indicative of the time we live in that just as the nation and the international community were preparing for what we had hoped to be the opportunity to exit COVID-19 and its consequential social and economic impact, we have moved directly into the ripple effect of a war in the middle of Europe. I don't think that at this stage anyone can accurately project what those new impacts will be like, as we are still in the early stages of that conflict, and one that could go in any number of dangerous directions, except to say that they will undoubtedly be consequential. We already see what is happening with the cost of energy and food prices, and in an environment where we were already months or years away from restoring supply chain resilience, we are realistically expecting ongoing economic turbulence. With respect to yesterday's budget announcement, let me briefly say that we are appreciative of the continuation of the policy of no new taxes and the reduction of the assets tax. And we applaud the Finance Minister for his acknowledgement of the imperative to support financial inclusion by reducing Know Your Customer requirements, if the latter serves to encourage the establishment of small bank accounts, the wider society benefits. I note these in the context of our chamber having had occasion to say earlier this week that one of our main priorities now is to press for the removal of some of the key impediments that are increasing or have the potential to increase the cost of financing to all businesses and especially small businesses. For instance, we are convinced that there are other initiatives that can be deployed. We have drawn reference to the widespreads in foreign exchange purchasing and sales, the increases in bank fees, the movement upwards of the BOJ policy rate, and its foreseeable impact on the interest rates, and the restrictions on the raising of capital in US dollars. Inasmuch as we need to rebound, we are concerned that we do not be limited in the scope for growth in what is a very uncertain period. CEO, presenters, listeners, let me end my remarks there and welcome you once again to this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. I now hand over to our moderator, Mrs. Emily Shields, attorney at law and talk show host.
We're here for you. We are written into this land. You are written into our story. Together stronger we stand. Your win is our victory. We're a firm foundation, here to stay. Build you a brighter way. Transform your everyday.
VM Group. Transform your everyday.
Dreams and even bigger hills to climb. This life is one big road with many curves and winds. When you need a friend to guide you to the strength you have inside, VM will be your guide, always by your side. We're a firm foundation, here to stay. Build you a brighter way, yeah. Transform your everyday. Turn your dreams to reality. VM makes you all you can be, yes. Transform your everyday. Transform your
VM
everyday.
Group. Transform your everyday.
Welcome to the Post-Budget Forum 2022, which is presented by VM Investments Limited, a subsidiary of the VM Group. This Post-Budget Forum is presented in collaboration with the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce, the JCC, and it was first presented in 2016 in keeping with VM Group's strategic objective of educating all of us. I'm honored to be the moderator for the second consecutive year, and I'm Emily Shields. By way of background, VM Investments Limited is the arm of the VM Group, which provides investment solutions for individuals and corporate entities of all sizes and types. This forum is live on several platforms in the group here. We're live on Jamaica News Network, JNN, One Spot Media, Power 106. We're also on TVJ's YouTube channel. And we're also streaming on VMG's Facebook page and VM Wealth's YouTube channel. And I thank so much the CEO of VM Investments Limited of giving us some background, as well as the representative from the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce. Now, every year around this time, as you should know, a budget is presented by the Finance Minister in Parliament. The budget outlines the intended spend and the intended revenue streams for the new fiscal year, which starts on the 1st of April and ends on the 31st of March the next year. The budget for the fiscal year commencing the 1st of April 2022 was presented by Dr. Nigel Clark on the 8th of March 2022. Crucially, at this time of the presentation of the budget, the country and the world, they face the twin dilemma of the pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But here is the picture for this fiscal year as outlined by Finance Minister Dr. Nigel Clark.
The central government plans to spend a total of $912 billion, comprised of $604.5 billion on non-debt expenditure, $307.5 billion on debt service, or $912 billion. The program's central government non-debt expenditure above the line is $604.5 billion and reflects an increase of 5% or 29.2 billion, 5.2%, over the non-debt third supplementary estimates. The central bank government's non-debt expenditure is 539.4 billion in recurrent expenditure and 65.1 billion in capital expenditure. Madam Speaker, as I mentioned, compensation for employees accounts for the large share of recurrent expenditure. 53% of recurrent expenditure, or 290.2 billion. It includes 6.4 billion towards the payment of government contribution to the public health scheme and 1.4 billion to settle employers' contribution to the NHT. Along with fixed motor vehicle allowances previously classified under programs, these are now in compensation of employees. Madam Speaker, just highlights on recurrent allocation, $40 billion towards public sector pension payments. Madam Speaker, 40 billion. 3 billion to the payment of streetlights, Madam Speaker, and 1.2 billion to the Student Loans Bureau. There'll be 3.6 billion to Statin, of which 2.4 billion is to cover the cost of Jamaica's 15th housing census. Education will continue to receive the lion's share of the budget, with 122 billion representing 20.2% of the non-debt expenditure. Health, Madam Speaker, next at 93.1 billion, and national security at 92.4 billion, as the government continues to prioritize health and national security as important to the people, to the well-being of the people of Jamaica. In agriculture, allocation 800 million for farm roads and $1 billion for production incentives. And Madam Speaker, on social spending, 16.9 billion being allocated to the PATH program, of which certain components for the cash grant, 7.9 billion, 800 million for social pension, and 7.7 billion towards the Ministry of Education for student nutritional support, 6.3 billion, 1 billion for the provision of textbooks, and 380 million for past school transportation. Given the catalytic impact of capital expenditure, Madam Speaker, I'm pleased that we're increasing capital expenditure by 20% in 2022-2023. What is more significant is that last year's capital budget benefited from a one-off dividend from the central bank, which we did not have this year, but I'm pleased that we still grow CapEx by 20%. We're well on our way to restoring capital expenditure to pre-pandemic levels. We'll continue to prioritize infrastructure expenditure, which increases the productivity of the economy, provides employment, and is therefore growth enhancing. As such, within the capital budget, $20.7 billion is allocated to the Southern Coastal Highway, $4.9 billion to the Montego Bay Perimeter Road, $4.9 billion to the Ministry of Health for the program to expand hospitals throughout Jamaica, $2.4 billion to the National Identification Project, and $1.9 billion for the procurement of 50 of 100 garbage trucks for acquisition the following 50 in the next fiscal year.
Also, the debt overhang for Jamaica has been a major challenge for the country, and Dr. Nigel Clark spoke to that, and in speaking to that yesterday, what he told us is that even with the massive spend in this pandemic, we've managed to contain the debt at about 110% of GDP, and by the end of this fiscal year, it could be down to about 96% of GDP. We'll be discussing that and more in a moment. But among the announcement made yesterday, as you heard mentioned by Mr. Ian Nita, President of the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce, he told us the news we've all been wanting to hear. There will be no new taxes.
And I'm pleased to begin my remarks by informing the people of Jamaica that there will be no new taxes. No new taxes, Madam Speaker. We are prioritizing economic recovery. We want to achieve economic recovery in the quickest possible time. At this time would run counter to that objective. Madam Speaker, this is the 7th consecutive fiscal year. 7th. Where on a net basis we have not raised taxes, and the 5th consecutive year where there's absolutely no new taxes, Madam Speaker. No, Madam Speaker, yesterday oil prices hit the highest level in more than a decade due to developments related to the war in Ukraine. Though we know this will be temporary, this appreciation in the price of oil has a negative impact on Jamaica and Jamaican consumers in the meantime. There are several persons, including those, some of them, some people in opposition, who have advocated for a removal of all of the, or part of the special consumption tax of $7 per litre that was placed on petrol by the previous administration in March 2015. Madam Speaker, I ask Jamaicans to first consider the facts. We can't argue facts.
That's Dr. Nigel Clark and a couple of excerpts from his presentation. It was over 3 hours long, a lot to wade through, all of the issues arising from the budget. And against the background of all that was said in relation to the budget, we continue to have the problem with crime. Murders in particular, out of control. We've had some good news because the numbers have trended down in the last couple of months, but even so, they're higher than any of us would be comfortable with. So to help us talk through all of these issues, we here have assembled an interesting panel. We're going to begin. Dr. Damian King, economist, executive director of the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, CAPRI. He'll dissect the implications for Jamaica's short and medium-term economic outlook. Professor Anthony Harriott, noted academic, social commentator, who will consider the Jamaican crime monster the very stubborn beast that continues to hinder the nation's growth prospects and the ways in which we can break the back of crime. Also, among our panelists here today, we have leading opinion leaders in Jamaica. We have Courtney Campbell, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the VM Group. Also with him, you heard Ian Nita giving a welcome, President of the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce. Larry Watson, CEO, JCC. David McBean, Executive Director, Monov School of Business and Management. Lloyd Diston, Chairman of the Crime Consensus Monitoring and Oversight Committee. And we also have as well Samaria Brown, a UWI student. She is a VMIL scholarship recipient. And throughout all of this forum, what we're going to be doing is hearing from them as and when necessary. And they're also free to ask questions so that we can sift through the issues that dog us at the moment with the backdrop of the budget and crime being the focus. I will tell you before I ask Damian King to begin with his 10-minute presentation that the hashtag for the forum is Post-Budget Forum 2022 and VM Investments or VMIL Post-Budget Forum 2022. So to connect with us on social media, please use one of those hashtags. Dr. Damian King, I begin with you. You can tell us the implications for Jamaica's short and medium-term economic outlook against the background of Dr. Clark's presentation.
Thank you, Emily. Hi, everyone. We're going to talk about the invading artillery versus local forces. This is not about the war in Europe. It's actually about Jamaica's post-pandemic economy. Well, it actually is about the war in Europe, but we'll get to that. It's over. The pandemic is over. I'm not an epidemiologist, so I'm not talking about, no new variants to channel Dr. Clark are going to come along. I'm talking about from an economic point of view. If you look at the quarterly total output of the economy, GDP, starting with the one just before the pandemic began, the last quarter of 2019, you see that following that big drop in output 2 quarters later, that the economy has now, save for the margin of error, gone back to the level of production that it had before the pandemic. If we look at the unemployment rate, which hit record lows of 7.2% just before the pandemic. It ballooned to 12.6%. At the last reading of unemployment in Jamaica, it is back down to where it was before the pandemic. We were, again, for the margin of error, having more or less balanced fiscal budgets up until the pandemic hit in 2020, and that caused the fiscal deficit, the excess of expenditure over revenue, to drop to nearly 3% of GDP. Now it's moving back to, within a negligible amount of a balanced budget. So the recovery has happened. That is the context in which we're going to go forward. At any time, forecasting what's going to happen to the economy is an exercise in uncertainty. And that's always the case. That's the case now. But the forces at work in determining where we are going to go are unusually clear. On one side, we have what we call the invading artillery. That is to say, global forces that are affecting Jamaica's economy. The one that is much talked about and much felt is the bottlenecks in the global supply chain. That has raised the cost of shipping over the last 12 to 15 months by on average of 5 times. So something that would cost you $1,000 to bring into Jamaica a year and a half ago is now costing you $5,000. That is raising the prices of goods and services that all have to be shipped at some point, raising the prices of goods and services in countries around the world. Accordingly, and consistent with the rest of the world, Jamaica's inflation rate has gone up from an average of 5% per year to now approaching 10% per year. Now, the Bank of Jamaica's inflation target is between 4 and 6%. We can see that we are now way above the inflation target. As a result, and because the Bank of Jamaica is committed to having inflation rate within that target, it has had to increase what they call their policy rate. The policy rate is the rate that the central bank pays to commercial banks. When they raised the policy rate from what was 0.5 percentage point up until recently, all the way now up to 4%. That is going to raise the cost of borrowing, the rate of interest that banks charge you. It's going to make banks more reluctant to lend and make it more expensive for you to borrow. All of that, even though it is targeted at bringing down the rate of inflation, it is going to dampen spending in the economy. It's going to make people be willing to borrow to spend less and more willing to save instead of spending. So that's a contractionary force on the economy. And now we get to the war in Europe. Well, the first effect of it is that it has caused the spot price of oil on world markets to skyrocket. The price of a barrel of oil on world markets was nearly zero 1 year ago. It is now up to $115 a barrel. We have not seen oil at over $100 a barrel for 7 years. Of course, Jamaica is a completely oil-dependent economy, mostly entirely energy dependent on imported energy because of oil. And so that's going to, as well, increase the cost of production in Jamaica. The war in Europe also exposes and creates a greater appreciation for geopolitical risk. That means that global investors are now going to be more conscious of investing in foreign countries, countries that they are not so familiar with the culture and the runnings. So for a country like Jamaica, which is highly indebted and has a public debt that it has to keep rolling over, this causes 2 problems. First, it will become more difficult simply to get capital to come to Jamaica. It's more difficult to access capital to begin with, and foreign direct investment into Jamaica and other countries like Jamaica is likely to fall. And even what you can get your hands on, the cost of it is going to rise to compensate for the increased perception of risk. So over the next 12 to 24 months, the situation we are facing in terms of what is coming in from outside of Jamaica is hostile. But against that, there are some propitious, some positive local forces. Let's look at Jamaica's public debt to GDP ratio. We were one of the most highly indebted countries in the world, and this goes back to 8 years ago. And we see that the trajectory of debt has steadily and consistently come down. It took a hit, of course, having to deal when the government had to deal with the pandemic, and revenues fell, and public health-related expenditures went up. But as Minister Clark mentioned yesterday in the budget debate, that has started to come back down. Debt reduction is on a trajectory that is downward, and that is going to continue. That is going to create more what they call fiscal room, that the government is going to have a greater opportunity to make budget presentations where it can boast of no new taxes and release even more funds for public services and for investing in infrastructure. Jamaica has strong savings. The net international reserves is the country's savings account. And it has been hovering around just over $3 billion, $3 billion US dollars, and even now stands somewhere around 3.5 billion US dollars. That's a lot of savings to tide us over what can happen to us in the short run in terms of negative shocks from the rest of the world. There are some other factors that are in place. Jamaica has been engaged in institutional strengthening and infrastructure building for some time now. It's a long list, and I've been limited by the moderator to 10 minutes, but just for some highlights, we have a fiscal responsibility framework. That is what has brought the country's debt down on that trajectory that we saw earlier. And that fiscal responsibility framework constrains even an ill-thinking government from getting too profligate when elections are coming up. The central bank has been made constitutionally independent. You know, the greatest threat to inflation is not global shocks like oil prices and droughts that constrain the food supply. The greatest threat to inflation around the world is governments forcing a central bank to print money for the benefit of the government that is too weak to raise taxes and borrow openly. Making the central bank independent means that the central bank can focus on keeping inflation low, which is critical for an environment of economic growth. To buttress that, the central bank has explicitly committed to an inflation target, 4 to 6%. That inflation target, again, creates an environment for long-run economic growth. There is reform of how public boards are to be appointed, so you can look forward to better management of public institutions. A fiscal commission. The legislation has been passed, and the fiscal commission is going to be a body independent of the government to do analysis of the government's expenditures and revenues so that the public can be informed about what are the implications of new expenditure measures and new taxes. And as everybody has observed, Jamaica has been investing large amounts in expanding its highway network and improving its road network. This is something that our governments had been, by and large, neglecting nearly since independence. And there's nothing more important to economic prosperity than being able to move people and cargo around the country. So when we look at the negative forces that are impacting the economy and are coming from outside of Jamaica, and the positive forces of the institutional building and the infrastructure strengthening that has been going on, we see what is the trade-off, what is the two factors that are going to determine what happens over the next 1 to 2 years. Take heart from this, that however long it takes those supply chain bottlenecks to work out, and however long it takes the war in Europe to end, those are temporary factors. Institutional strength and infrastructure are permanent changes. So the longer term prospect looks positive. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Damian King. You can bank on Dr. King for putting it all in perspective, in the correct perspective, considering all of the variables that are material. So on the whole then, Dr. King, as you track Jamaica's debt reduction, which is on a downward trajectory, I still don't understand how we've managed as a country within the context of the pandemic and the spend that the government has done for a number of people giving back some money. I don't understand how our debt could be on downward trajectory and there are other countries in the region that have gone in the opposite direction. Can you explain from your perspective how that has happened?
Indeed. Let us go back 5, 6, 7 years before, when we had a debt which was as high as 140% of GDP. Yes. And at that time, even though we were only the third most indebted country in the world, we had the highest rate of debt service in the world. Mm-hmm. We were paying, in some years, half of every dollar of revenue, of tax revenue, mm-hmm. in interest on debt. And the country had little savings. Mm-hmm. Imagine if the pandemic had come along then. Mm-hmm. If Jamaica had not made the decision to implement the fiscal reform, yes. the fiscal responsibility framework that created the room. One of the things that happened a couple of years ago is Jamaica started setting up, investing in a contingency fund. That is money set aside for when the next crisis comes. Mm-hmm. Within 2 years, the crisis of the pandemic came. So Jamaica's good fiscal management, mm-hmm. interestingly, across 2 administrations, started with the first IMF program under the PNP, continued with the second IMF program under the JLP. That investment in improved fiscal management is what put Jamaica in the position yes. to survive the greatest fiscal and economic impact that the country has faced since independence.
I have a group of opinion leaders who may have questions. Whenever you're ready, feel free, or if you have a comment, I want you to freely come in on this discussion. After we have a question and answer, then we're going to go to Professor Anthony Harriott with his presentation on crime. I've learned a lot from you in terms of the importance of inflation targeting over and above watching the value of the Jamaican dollar. One of the things I want you to reconcile for me is how any movement in the Jamaican dollar, any movement in interest rate as well, is going to lead to a greater debt burden for us based on the number of people that we owe money to. And in light of that, why is that not something that we need to be focusing on, perhaps alongside inflation targeting?
That is something we need to be focusing on. I mentioned in the presentation that there are a number of factors driving up interest rates globally and locally. Mm-hmm. If you are a big borrower, higher interest rates are going to hurt you. So in this downward trajectory, the government going forward is going to face the tricky situation of recognizing that the cost of carrying that debt is going to rise.
Yes.
And that is one of the challenges that they're going to face. That is part of the problem of what we call the invading artillery. Yeah. So they have to watch that. But at the same time, it is imperative that they do what they need to do with interest rates in order to bring inflation down. Because, as the Bank of Jamaica likes to boast, low, stable, and predictable inflation is is critical to an environment of long-run economic growth.
Yes, but what about the dollar then? Has the dollar no place and the value of the Jamaican dollar no place in all of this?
Well, this is why the focus on inflation is important. When I was in school, the Jamaican dollar and the US dollar exchanged at 1 for 1. We are now up to 150 odd to 1. The single reason for most of that change has been inflation. It's the same reason why housing prices have gone up just as much. The price of a bag of flour has gone up just as much. Inflation is happening to the price of a US dollar the same way it happens to the price of a pound of flour. So when you bring inflation down to 4, 5, 6%, you're also bringing down the long-run rate of depreciation of the currency. So that is going to allow the movement over the next year, 2, 3, 4, to go from 155 to 160 and not to 180.
Yes, a lot of people can't wrap their heads around this idea, Dr. King, and it took me a long time where you're saying inflation targeting it's sort of one and the same actually with the movement of the Jamaican dollar. A lot of people are saying if the value of the Jamaican dollar, if it depreciates, meaning if it costs more Jamaican dollar to buy 1 US, then the light bill, for example, is going to move. The goods that they buy in the supermarket and so forth, those are going to move. And people cannot get it in their heads that this is about inflation and not so much the movement in the dollar.
If you're making a decision that you're going to, you get an idea to start a business and to make some investment.
Yes.
If you are uncertain, if you have no idea what the exchange rate is going to be, in 10 years' time, you're not going to make an investment for which the payback is over 10 years. So this is why low inflation and therefore a low rate of exchange rate depreciation is critical to encouraging long-run investment.
Yes. Let me ask you this. There have been a lot of calls about the hedge contract or contracts that Jamaica had through Citibank. And a lot of people, particularly the opposition, has called in recent days for the removal of the special consumption tax on petrol in light of the price per barrel of oil at the moment, because they say it will give us all some breathing room. The minister, as you heard, didn't acquiesce to that, and he explained why he didn't. What he did instead was to put up a $2 billion supply to alleviate some of the problems on individuals. He says he will work that out. Do you agree with what he has done, or do you support the calls that that SCT should have been rolled back on fuel?
Well, the question to ask when you're comparing one policy stance with another is what is the objective? If the objective is relief for the citizenry that are facing economic hardship,
yes,
then if that is the objective, then you don't want to do it by lowering the price of petrol, because by and large, those who are well off are the ones that use the most petrol. So you are giving relief at the wrong end of the income scale. If welfare is your objective, it's always better to make it targeted to whatever amount of cost you're going to give up. The government, by reducing the petrol tax, will lose revenue. By using the expenditure program that the minister has proposed, they are going to spend. It is much better to do it in a way that actually hits the people that are neediest. And the minister's proposal does that in a very targeted way.
Yes.
Especially by focusing on the PATH program, which is very clearly targeted on the needy.
Right. Professor Harriet, I know you're going to speak on crime, but I know you watch these matters as well. Any thought on anything at all that Dr. King has presented or said on which you would like to comment?
I think I'll pass on it. Of course, there are implications for the crime problem. Importantly, over the years, we have been watching the investments in the institutions. That's critical. And I'll bring that out in what I have to say.
Right, right. And then, Dr. King, the other thing I wondered about, I heard Dr. Nigel Clark talk about this incentive that he wants to give to people who wishes to buy electric vehicles. And he caps it to a certain number. I think it's the first 100,000. Then you're going to have reduced duties on that, because ultimately what we want to do is to reduce our dependence on oil. Can you figure out the reason why, given the background and what he wants us to achieve, why that cap has been put on this 100,000 vehicles?
Well, he explained that the more people that take advantage of the reduced duty and import electric cars is the greater the loss of revenue to the government.
Yes.
And because he has to plan a budget, then he can't have any element of it be open-ended.
Yes.
He can't go forward and not know what it's going to cost him. And that is the reason why he has capped it.
You agree with that?
I mean, I can't criticize him for wanting to know what an element of his budget is going to cost him.
Yes.
But it does seem peculiar that you incentivize something and then you limit it in the event the incentive is actually taken up. So it does seem paradoxical.
Yes. Then the last thing I'll ask you before we go, and I will be happy to hear my president and CEO of VM Group and all of the representatives from VM here, it has to do with the matter of the banking fees. A number of people have clamored for there to be some government regulation of the fees. Dr. Clark didn't go that way. What he's done is to introduce some lower threshold, know your customer account, and he's also talked about the digital BOJ, the digital, what you call it? The digital passbook that will be recommended. And he says he will give people $2,500, the first 100,000 people, I believe, who open these particular accounts. What do you make of those two means by which they're moving around from capping the bank fees?
You know, the issue of bank fees raises its head every few years. And what I have noticed since it became a topic of public discussion a couple months ago, what I've noticed since then is the number of institutions in the financial sector, the number of banks that have been advertising that they have no fees. If half of the banks have no fees, what is the problem we're trying to solve?
The two big banks have fees.
Okay, so go to one of the other banks that are advertising no fees.
Are you with one of those banks?
I have two bank accounts.
You don't need to know how many you have. I'm asking if you're with one of the two big
answer
banks.
you. I have two bank accounts, and they are both at banks with low fees.
And do you recommend that?
If fees are important to you.
Yes.
That is not something that I need to dictate to somebody.
Yes.
If the service you are getting from a high-fee bank is worth it to you, then I'm not to tell you
Yes.
that you should go to a different bank. That's a decision you can make.
But the issue of government intervening to either legislatively cap
why does the government need to intervene? If I choose to go to a high-fee bank
Yes.
because I like the colors in that bank's logo,
yes,
that is my decision.
suffer with the high fees.
But if I am there on purpose,
Yes.
because I like the service, I'm not suffering. Maybe, you know, cars are expensive. Maybe we should pass legislation to cap the price of cars. So people who would like to buy BMWs don't get to buy BMWs because you can't sell a BMW below the price cap. People can make a personal choice. Many of the banks don't have high fees or fees at all.
Dr. Damian King, as always, talking his truth. Stay with us here. We're going to go to a break. When we come back, more from this very important Post-Budget Forum 2022. It's VM Investments Limited, a subsidiary of VM Group. Don't forget our hashtags, Post-Budget Forum 2022, VM Investments, and VMIL, Post-Budget Forum 2022. Much more when we come back.
VM Group. Transform your everyday.
We all have big dreams and even bigger hills to climb. This life is one big road with many curves and winds. When you need a friend to guide you to the strength you have inside, VM will be your guide, always by your side. We're a firm foundation here to stay, build you a brighter way, yeah. Transform your everyday, turn your dreams to reality. VM makes you all you can be, yes. Transform your everyday, transform your
VM
everyday.
Group. Transform your everyday.
Thank you so much for rejoining us here for the Post-Budget Forum 2022, which is presented by VM Investments Limited, a subsidiary of the VM Group. And this forum is also presented in collaboration with the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce. Thank you so much for rejoining us. I'm Emily Shields. I'm coming now to Professor Anthony Harriott to give us his presentation for 10 minutes on crime and the fix that is needed. Just before Professor Harriott comes in, I remind you, if you're watching, if you're listening and you do have questions, then please send them to us. We'll be happy to have our panelists answer those as soon as the presentation is over. You can send them using the hashtag as well, Post-Budget Forum 2022, and VM Investments, as well as VMIL Post-Budget Forum 2022. Also in the next segment, we are going to have interactions from our opinion leaders who are now ready and waiting. Here's Professor Harriott with the fix that is needed for crime.
Yes, so I want to do three things. And the first is to try to specify the challenge that we face. Not to talk about crime in general, but the specific aspects of it that are most immediate. Then I want to turn to listing, identifying selected features of the problem, and conclude with the outlines of how to respond to these particular features. So the structure of the presentation is very similar to that of Dr. King's. It's a kind of problem-solution structure. But in my case, there's a large excluded middle. I go from features to quote-unquote solutions, and so much is left out. I won't engage in any discussion about causes, proximate or root, and many aspects of the solution are going to be left out. I'm going to be focused on the immediate challenge of how to establish control of violent crime. Okay, so as I said, yeah, the central challenge is to establish control of the most serious crimes, in particular homicides and other violent crimes. So what does this mean? For me, it means trying to keep the levels of serious crime at the 2014 level. 2010 was a kind of turning point, in my opinion, in our experience with trying to control our serious crimes. As viewers would know, in 2010, there was the Dudos Tivoli incursion events, and thereafter, violent crime, all categories of serious crimes plummeted, approximately a 30% reduction after between 2010 and 2014. Thereafter, it has been a struggle to establish control. So I'm using that 2014 level as a marker for hanging on to the progress made during that period. So that's the level of control that we wish to establish. At worst, it's preventing a return to 2020 levels. In other words, a complete erasure of the advances since 2010. That's precisely what I mean by control here. But I want to suggest that perhaps we should do a little bit more than simply trying to establish control. It's sustained control, grounded in improved effectiveness of the mechanism of control, which is our criminal justice system, but to study and promote effectiveness while having due regard for due process. That is important because effectiveness can be achieved, as we all know, without regard for rule of law. Okay, so those are the three things that I want to do. So let me now turn to the selected features of the problem. There are around 4 that I wish to highlight. And the first is groupness. As I stated there, groupness may be regarded as the kind of booster engine of violent crime. And it takes the form of gangs, but sometimes families in conflict. And families like gangs are able to mobilize their support networks, be that a community and sometimes, or other gangs, or groupings or networks of gangs. So more and more persons are drawn into the conflict when it takes on a group character. What groupness does is that it increases tremendously the capacity of these networks of criminals to do things that they would not be able to do as individuals. So drug trafficking, extortion, rackets, these are things that are group-related crime. One needs to have a level of capacity to be able to do it. Importantly, it boosts criminal productivity. Lots of studies have been done on this. The level of criminal productivity of lone criminals is much lower than when individuals join groups and are active in gangs. In fact, in some communities elsewhere, gang presence increases the level of homicide by as much as 10 times. And we see a similar pattern here. And importantly, here in Jamaica, many of these groups, gangs, families in conflict, are rooted in their communities. And that makes it very, very difficult for law enforcement to effectively respond. And the conflicts tend to drag along and be extended in time. The second feature that I want to bring to the attention of our audience is the progressive erosion of boundaries over a long period of time. We all operate with boundaries, you know, and there are boundaries established by the law, and there are boundaries established by social groups, by the society at large. So I think, for example, here, the expectation would be that we wouldn't be speaking the Queen's English as such, but that we'd be speaking a Jamaican standard, and we wouldn't be speaking Creole. We wouldn't be speaking Patois. There's that expectation. And people will patrol the boundaries. If I was to try an Oxford accent, the minute I depart here or before I depart, I would be badgered by people saying how he sounds so spooky, thinks he's better than us, etc. There'd be a lot of social pressure. Similarly, if I were to speak Patois, they would say that's not appropriate for a university professor. We patrol these boundaries, right? So similar in relation to social boundaries, legal boundaries, right? And the maintenance of boundaries become more effective when both, in the case of crime, when both the legal and the social boundaries are pretty much coterminous, right? It's a really an important point for what I have to say. So what has happened over time with the erosion of these boundaries? We see it manifested in child killings, for example, elder homicide, the killing of women and innocent people, mass killings, etc., without regard for quote-unquote collateral damage. If we are to get to, this is what gives people a sense of violence being out of control, right? And then the third, if you wish, surface feature is overtness. Overtness of criminal activity in relation to the time of these activities, time of day. When I started my career researching this thing 30 years ago, going through the statistics in detail, the vast majority of serious crimes occurred between midnight and 4 a.m. The vast majority. That has shifted tremendously over time. It's no longer an activity that occurs in the dark, but in the light of day, which would signal to us that the people conducting this activity sense that there's low risk, right? And overtness also manifests itself in not even bothering to mask, knowing that you're on camera and committing crimes and so forth. It takes various forms. So that, again, has to do with the business of a breakdown in control. Related to overtness is what I call advertising success, advertising criminal success. And its overt expressions includes the mansions, the Audi Q7s and Q5s and so forth. All of these things advertise the success of criminality. And as we all know, if you want something to rapidly reproduce itself, allow it to be successful, right? Okay, so these are critical features that have to do with control. And then another observation. Crime has traveled over the last 4 or so decades from, if you wish, the margins of society into its mainstream, right? It's not an activity of few marginalized people. It's in the mainstream of everyday life as conflicts turn violent, right? And it occurs not just among what we would call stereotypical criminals or certified criminals, but it occurs in everyday life among everyday ordinary people, right? Just a simple statistic. We had around 1,400 homicides last year, and most of those homicides were committed by gangs, if you wish, career criminals, accounting the main for them. But we also had around 25,000 incidents of serious injuries reported at the hospitals. Those are not injuries committed by gangsters or between gangsters. That's just ordinary, everyday people allowing conflicts to get out of hand. So it's a deep issue is the point that I want to make, and therefore somewhat difficult to control. So to summarize the features that I want to bring to the attention of your viewers, the 4 features that I have identified a while ago may be summed up in a single word: stubbornness. Stubbornness of the problem. There has been a tendency for it to return to the trend line, to return to the 2010-2009 trajectory, right? And therefore a battle to kind of keep it to the 2014 levels. And it is stubborn for the reasons that I've given, because of the features that I have described, which we could also sum as the problem becoming cultural, not just something generated by socioeconomic root causes, but because the problem has been chronic over many, many decades, right? People have adapted to it. Deeper social processes have occurred. So there are sets of beliefs and attitudes and behaviors, some as an orientation towards violence, that I use the term subcultural violence to capture. And it has some, let me just highlight some features, because we talk about culture of this and culture of that, and that is not how I'm using the word. I'm being very specific, right? So there are some additional features. One is hypersensitivity to insults. This is the dissing problem, right? And dissing, hypersensitivity to insult, is not just a problem among criminals. It's acute among criminals and gangsters, but it permeates the society as well. It doesn't go violent, thankfully, with the vast majority of us, but it tends to go violent with around 25–30% of our males, right? That's a huge number. And then the second feature of the subculture is a strong orientation towards exacting revenge on those who diss you or offend you in any way. I've measured it as well, so I have a sense for how much it permeates the society. I'll come back to that in a moment. The fourth thing is love of the gun. And finally, the behavioral expression as weapons carrying. To sum all of that, I measured these things, these indicators of what I'm calling subcultural violence, around 20 years ago. And it showed up a problematic 30%. In other words, 30% of all males have this orientation towards violence. And interestingly, 15% of all females. And I think we are seeing some of that in the incidents that are unfolding before us. Okay, so that's the problem. Those are the features that I wish to highlight, limited to the central problem of how do we control this thing. What I'm suggesting is these are key features to zero in on if we want to exercise effective control, right? So the outlines of the response organized in that way. First, the problem of overtness. What we have to recognize is that overt violence means, in the main, that the violent actors have no expectation of being punished. In other words, we have an impunity problem. And that is reflected in low conviction rates. My estimate is that the conviction rate for murder is somewhere around 8%. And it has been there for a while. Now I can hear the people in the courts sending up red flags and feeling alarmed. This is 8% of the murders that occur in a given year, right? The court puts out statistics which estimate that they have a conviction rate approaching 40%. But that's 40% of the murder cases put before the courts, right? Not of all murders. Avoid any confusion there. I can see you getting a little, giving me my wrap-up signal, so I'm going to rush. I'm going to rush to the end now, right? Okay, so yeah, so this impunity problem is critical to control. And I think it begins with control of the public spaces. Many of our public spaces are now wired with CCTV. People need to be known that they are under surveillance in the public spaces, and the police needs to aggressively respond to the incidents that show up in the public square and to push violence, as I would put it, out of the public square. That's the first thing, right? That I think we need to do. And generally, we need to improve our conviction rates, and in so doing, generate a bit of general deterrence. This is key to what I am saying, right? And to generate general deterrence, we have to use the courts more. We have to get more gang-related convictions. The Klansman case is a big test of this. I'm eyeing it very, very closely, because if it goes well, then it will put gangsters on the back foot. It will signal to them that they are under investigation. They'll have to reassess their risk. In other words, it will generate a measure of deterrence. But look at the other side. If it goes the other way, people are going to say the system is a joke, right? Remember how the trial started. It began with laughter until the witnesses showed up and they understood that this was really a serious investigation. They did not expect a serious investigation. Okay, so it's through the courts that we have to change this assessment of risk and help the public also to better understand what is taking place there. Okay, one last point on this business of the overtness, right? Or rather, let me leave that alone and shift to the erosion of boundaries. Restoring boundaries. I'm wrapping up. Restoring boundaries. So we had an interesting case in St. Thomas of that child that went missing. And what happened in St. Thomas was outrage when the child went missing, which means that this idea that we have in Jamaica that people are numb to violence and so forth, it's not all gone. There is something there to be harnessed, right? And that, to me, was the significance of the St. Thomas response. Let me say a few more words on it. When the child went missing, there was almost an automatic, instant mobilization of people. My understanding is that over 400 persons self-mobilized to participate in the search, right? And that included people from the immediate area. And it is also my understanding that the child was found because the people were familiar with the area and observed things that a soldier or police person unfamiliar with the area would not have observed. And that's how they discovered the child, right? Now, to me, this presents an opportunity for us to restore boundaries and to patrol them by harnessing this potential among our people. How to do it? To date, we generally say people must report. In other words, the idea that we have is that people should be the eyes and ears of the police force. I think it needs more than that. And I sum up the more in the idea of co-production of security between citizens and the criminal justice system. This means we have to create structures of participation for people to do what was done in St. Thomas in disciplined, law-abiding ways, so that these cases enter the courts and are settled there. Okay, let me sum it up in that. So to conclude, I think that there's much to work with, that the immediate challenge is to establish control, and there are elements that are present that needs to be, in my opinion, simply refined, better calibrated. And if we're able to do that, then it gives us a platform to do greater things, to move to serious violence reduction and crime reduction.
Thank you so much, Professor Anthony Harriott, with that presentation. Can I just invite a comment from Chairman of the Crime Consensus Monitoring and Oversight Committee, Lloyd Distant, who is part of the opinion leaders here in the studio with us. Your thoughts on the presentation, Lloyd Distant, and what is it within the context of what was presented and what you know from where you sit? What else can we do about the crime?
So thank you, Emily, for the opportunity, and I thank Professor Harriet for that presentation. It's always quite instructive to get the guidance from his perspective and certainly from his studies. So from the presentation he has made, there are two areas I pick up primarily. One is around, I'm going to say, increased effectiveness in policing. So that's a component of the control, utilizing the CCTVs and those other elements. And then another component that certainly came out very clearly is the effectiveness of the justice system. So the feeling that there's going to be consequences as a result of the actions of these criminal gangs. I particularly liked that he closed speaking about the role of the community, because from our perspective, to achieve a sustainable reduction will really require all of Jamaica coming together in this fight against crime. What did pop to my mind, Prof. Harriet, as you're going through, is there's one element when I think about the ecosystem of the criminal justice system itself, is the back end, the role of correctional services. We often hear that the correctional services institutions at this point in time are more of an educational playground for some of for some of the persons who are incarcerated. I'd certainly like to get some thoughts from Prof. Harriet in terms of the role of the correctional services in achieving this reduction and this sustainable reduction in crime primarily.
Okay.
Yes. Prof, go ahead. Role of correctional services.
Yeah. Okay. So let me first link this to what I'm saying. I may be going off on a tangent a little, right? In relation to the question, but I want to tie it with something that I'm saying here. For the correctional services to be effective, we have to have fewer prisoners in there. For it to be effective in rehabilitating serious criminals, we have to have fewer people in there, right? So how do we get fewer people in there? We get fewer people in there if the system generates general deterrence. In other words, if by putting people in there, for say every person you put in there, you deter 10, right? Or at least you deter 1, right? Then you're going to get fewer people in there. And therefore, able to administer better treatment, more effective treatment to the people who are in there, right? So for me, the first challenge then is how to bring corrections into the system of not individual. That's what it does now. For as long as you are in there, you can't commit crimes on the street. You may be able to commit crimes in there, but you can't. Well, let me take that back a little, right? We hope that you wouldn't be able to commit crimes out there, right? It's not doing it as effectively. So at least it should be doing that, right? It should be getting to base one, which is providing individual deterrence. When we put you in there, it means for the period in there, you are deterred. Okay. So the first judgment of the correction system is how well it does that. One could argue it's failing on that ground in a serious way. So that's the first thing to be fixed, right? And then to move to base 2 of getting it to generate general deterrence. So our juveniles that are in the system, right? How do we get their stories communicated to their peers so that their delinquent peers have a notion of risk and opportunity in the society? And bringing in the opportunity part, because you can't have just the opportunity and expect to have deterrence. You have to have both risk and opportunity, right? Information. deterrence travels on information so that a rational person can do a calculation of risk. Okay, so it has to organize itself in a way to be able to do that, right? That is what I would like to see, right? And I don't think that this is a matter so much of ideas. I think it's a matter of the system being just bogged down, right, in trying to deal with the day-to-day challenges. And I don't want to be unfair to anybody, but not having a clear pathway as how you get from where you are now to where you wish to be.
All right.
And that's the kind of discussion that I'm eager to participate in.
I'd be happy to have another comment from my opinion leaders. As soon as you're ready, you can just let me know. Until then, let me take a question from the people on social media, in the audience watching on the various platforms that we have. We have OJ O. Henry from YouTube, and I think this would be for Dr. Damian King. What is your view on the proposed unemployment insurance product to limit exposure to adverse unemployment events in Jamaica? That was presented by Dr. Clark yesterday.
It's really important
Yes.
for countries to have what we call social safety nets. And particularly countries that are vulnerable to economic shocks and natural disasters. The social safety net means that if people lose their income for any reason or are unable to earn one, that there is some collective element. There is something that government does or there is some architecture that allows people to continue to feed their families.
Yes.
So insofar as it's an element in our social safety net, it's positive. But it's really important that when we are considering different possible elements of the social safety net, that we look at which are the groups that are the neediest.
Yes.
Unemployment insurance only works for those who are formally employed.
Yes.
The neediest in our society, the ones who are really, really struggling to get by, don't have formal sector jobs. Some of them have never had formal sector jobs. Those, I would say, in the bottom 25% are going to be little helped by unemployment insurance.
Right.
So it is to be seen in that context, that it's going to help some people, but it's not where the greatest need in the society is when you talk about a social safety net.
We've always talked about the informality of the Jamaican society. Why is it taking so long to make substantial portions of it a bit more formal?
It's taking so long because we have an economy and regulations that incentivize people to be informal. When we have a national housing trust that represents a tax of 5% on the wage bill, effectively, a tax in quotation marks. And the vast majority of people who make that contribution, the neediest people who make that contribution, are unlikely to see themselves as getting a benefit from it. Both the employer and the employee are incentivized to skip that system.
But they do get a benefit. They may not get enough to get a house for 30-odd million, but they can get their contributions back as a yearly contribution refund.
How many of them get their contributions back?
They can if they apply, and it's quite easy.
Yes, they do, but how many of them do?
But they should.
And they do so at a lower real value because the rate of interest that is paid on it is below the rate of inflation. So even those that do get a loss, so the best you can do is make a loss.
Yes.
Okay? That and other regulations, we have a national insurance scheme. It's important to have a national insurance scheme, but inflation erodes the pension that you get so rapidly that you end up not getting back value for money. We incentivize our labor force to be informally employed. And until we get rid of the incentive to be informally employed, we're going to have an informal economy.
I'll come back to that housing trust matter on another program with you because I'm quite interested in your view on it. Dr. King, we have James from Twitter asking, wouldn't even a temporary suspension of the gas tax have been helpful in mitigating impact on manufacturing and other sectors while we hold our breaths until the Ukraine situation ends, Dr. King?
If your target is manufacturers, first of all, I'm not sure why manufacturers worship a higher God than farmers and service companies. But if your target, for whatever reason you can make, is manufacturers, then target the manufacturers. So as I said earlier in this discussion, first question is, what is the target? What is the objective? And then institute a measure that meets that target.
Yes. Dr. Matt Bean, who's here, the Executive Director, Mona School of Business, among my opinion leaders in the audience. Have you a thought on any of the questions or any comment you wish to make at this time? On anything interesting you may have heard?
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. And I'll just demask briefly.
Yes.
The question I have is for Dr. King surrounding inflation. We call 4 to 6% inflation low, but we know typically in, let's just say, more advanced economies, this could be anything between 1.5 to 2.5%. And if you look at the difference in what we'd call purchasing power, so if you're 2% in 10 years, 128 units then will be able to purchase what 100 did. But if we're at 6%, it's almost 180 units to purchase what 100 did 10 years ago. So the context for that is, it should we be over time have more aggressively lower inflation targets? And also, are you satisfied that our basket of goods and services that are used for the CPI are indeed representative? Thank you.
Well, let me answer the second question first. The basket is highly representative. It's a large number of goods. It covers the entire island. It is regularly revised, and it is highly, highly unlikely that the real rate of inflation, the real rate at which a small collection of goods and services are rising, are significantly different from the basket, given how large the basket is. So let's get rid of that. There's a problem with high inflation, or even moderate inflation. The problem, though, is not that it erodes wages and salaries. And we have data on this, because Statin collects data on average wages and salaries going all the way back, 40 years. And if you look at the growth of wages and salaries on average over the long term, it matches the rate of price inflation. So that is not the problem. The problem with inflation is twofold. I mentioned one already, that high inflation creates uncertainty in the economy. It makes it difficult to forecast what your selling price is going to be and your wage bill is going to be, and in particular, what the inflation rate is going to be. So low inflation creates stability. Second problem with inflation is that it affects the poor more than the well-off, because the well-off tend to hold their wealth in terms of actual real assets. They own cars and houses and land. And the values of those, the prices of those go up with inflation. The poor tend to hold almost all of the wealth that they have, whatever savings they have, in cash. And cash loses value. So you find, if you look at the inflation rate, whenever it goes up, the poverty index goes up. So it's important to have low inflation. The measure of inflation is not perfect, and to aim for something as low as 1 or 2% brings in some other risks and some other bottlenecks that we can't explore here. But there's a reason why we don't aim for zero inflation.
Yes.
There are good reasons why we don't aim for zero inflation.
Give us one good reason.
Well, one good reason is that you have a situation where, as I said, inflation is an estimate, and trying to aim for it is uncertain. If you aim and you miss it by going too low, the contractionary effect on the economy is severe. You get into not just a recession, you could get into a depression.
Yes.
If you aim and you're a little above it, you get a little inflation. So just to be safe, like if you're trying to shoot an apple, if somebody forces you to shoot an apple off of the head of somebody, you aim high.
Yes.
if you can't hit the target exactly.
Yes.
So
And
that's why it's better to have a small amount of inflation.
yes. And then Dr. McBean's question saying 1 to 1.5% is low in some countries, but within the context of our country and the history of the double-digit inflations we've had, I suppose 4 to 6% is considered low for our cultural experience.
It's low for of our experience, and it gives you enough stability that people can plan long term.
Right. I have another question here from one of the members of the audience. This is for Professor Harriot. Does the projected allocation for national security reflect the seriousness that the crime fight deserves at this time?
Okay, so there have been big investments in the security forces over the last few years. Numbers have increased, equipment increased, and there's an ongoing process of what's generally summed up as modernization.
Yes.
Giving them tools to make themselves more effective. And I think it's generally speaking money well spent, right? But we also have to watch the return. And I would keep a keen eye on the return before making additional huge investments.
The
Right?
return
In other words,
on the investment.
yeah, in other words, it's time for a bargain
Yes.
with the criminal justice system, and in particular with the police and the military.
Yes.
That, yeah, you've gotten these allocations, now show us the return.
Yes.
You can't keep asking for more without showing some results.
Yes.
And I think that applies to several things. It applies to numbers, it applies to getting them to make more effective, for example, their system of keeping their fleet mobile. Right? So if you have huge numbers of police officers and they can't move because you don't have a proper system for maintaining the cars and so forth, there are lots of inefficiencies can ensue in the system. So that's where my eye is now, and I think those things systems needs to be fixed, and internal systems and external systems of accountability need to put some pressure.
Right. Well, one of my opinion leaders, a couple of my opinion leaders who are here in studio have a comment. I think Mr. Courtney Campbell, President and CEO of VM Group, let's hear your thoughts on all that has gone on and where you want to come in.
Yeah, so sorry, are you hearing me? My question is really for Dr. King. That's really a comment. I will comment on the banking fees another time.
Well, thank you for that. Dying to hear you.
But Dr. King, we have an imminent retirement crisis in Jamaica.
Yes.
Because, good news, we're all living longer. But the bad news is that the percent of the working population covered by private pension schemes is abysmally low. Now, the minister announced a raft of measures that will be included in pensions reform, things like making pension rights portable,
yes,
and the mandatory vesting and so on. Will these be enough, in your opinion, to avert the crisis?
Well, the short answer is I don't know whether it's going to be enough. But as you have mentioned, it's welcome that it's a start. It's an initial set of measures, and it doesn't mean it's the final set of measures. Also bear in mind that what we were talking earlier about the importance of a social safety net. Many people do have the means to save up and have something when they get to retirement. Again, we need to focus on the neediest. And one of the incredibly positive steps that this country has made recently is last year when they introduced a public universal pension scheme where the government pays everybody 75 years or older a regular income. And so that can help to support whatever is not adequate in terms of the measures for the neediest. It's a small amount, but again, hopefully, as the fiscal situation improves, then the government can increase that.
Right. Let me have a comment or a question from Resworth Butcherson, the CEO of VM Investments Limited.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I have a question for Professor Harriot. Um, the, so earlier when I gave my remarks, I spoke about personal responsibility for all Jamaicans to addressing the crime problem. And I also gave a charge to the various associations in terms of tackling the problem. I understand from the organizers that there are about 10,000 persons listening on the call, and a number of them are very influential persons in their space, etc. My question is, well, what is the, because I really don't want this to be another talk shop. I mean, we've been through too many of these. What would be some initial first steps that we can all make, whether it be from the CEO level or in our communities or associations or on our boards? What would be your call to action, ignoring the responsibility of the government of the day? But what would that be? What would the two things that you would say, or three things that you would say, team, let us be the first to address this thing, and here are some steps for us to move forward.
Okay, so the first thing is find some organization, some civic organization through which you can actively engage in some useful work to try to improve the situation in your community or somebody else's community if there isn't a crime problem in your community. So there are neighborhood watches. Those are dedicated to dealing with the crime problems. So they often go to sleep when the community isn't faced with any serious issue. You could try to wake those up in your area and make them more purposeful, have plans of work to make their communities safer, rather than just episodic responding to events and so forth, or participate in some all-purpose groups, right? And within those all-purpose groups, you have some dedicated effort to dealing with the crime problem, right?
One of the things I've wondered, Prof, I cannot understand, why is it that in 2022, we don't have some model communities with eyes in the sky in every public street, in every thoroughfare, and we could demonstrate by those CCTV cameras how reduction in crime can come with the persistent and the non-sleeping eye in the sky. And I've wondered too, especially in light of the CEO of VM Investment asking, what can we do to move this from a talk shop? Wouldn't a group like VM perhaps do good in investing through collaboration with whatever ministries and whatever in making these model communities properly set up with CCTV? Is that something that you would consider recommending?
That certainly would be helpful, right? But for residential areas, neighborhoods, communities, if you wish,
yes,
I would more emphasize participatory structures, and people finding purpose, setting themselves specific tasks to be done within a particular period of time to make their communities safer. Some police divisions, for example, work with their citizens to develop their policing plans. Citizens have an opportunity to tell the police what they consider to be the priorities in their locale and to ensure that that is reflected in the plan. Citizens can play a role in ensuring that their particular police unit, be it subdivision, station, or whatever, delivers on the plan, right? In other words, play a role in accountability, in ensuring that the institutions of state are more responsive to their particular needs That will only be done if there is some structure there that is linked in a disciplined way with the structures of the state. That's the idea that I was getting to when I cited the St. Thomas experience.
Yes, yes. Got you. Thank you. Don't forget the hashtag is Post-Budget Forum 2022, hashtag VM Investment, hashtag VMIL Post-Budget Forum. Just before we come to a question from another member of the audience, let me go to Samario Brown, who is a US student and who is also the VM Investments Limited scholarship recipient with a question or comment. Over to you, Samario.
Hi everyone, I'm Samaria Brown. Just helping out Emily here, my pronunciation.
Thank
Yes.
you. Appreciate it. Sorry.
So this is in response to your presentation, Professor Harriet. So as a computer science student and a data scientist, I believe that in our efforts to combat crime in Jamaica and try to control it, we should perhaps approach this process from a data science standpoint and perspective. Because of course we have data on crime that has occurred for over 20 years in Jamaica. I recently looked at a data set yesterday actually, dating back to 2005 with the data that we currently have on crime. So one way we could do this is perhaps open source the data sets that we have that JSCF has collected from the historical data or crime that we have occurred in Jamaica, and allow this to be public to students, to the universities, to data scientists in Jamaica to assist in identifying trends and insights to assist rather in helping to strategically plan for controlling crime. So my question to you is, how are we as a nation or law enforcers leveraging the data that we have here, or historical data on crime, to approach crime fighting?
I think a lot of improvements have taken place here. There was a time when police would simply generate crime statistics, but it wouldn't be used in any meaningful way to craft strategy or to hold people to account and so forth. We have made some advances there. The crime patterns do inform strategy at divisional level and nationally. I would love to see it being used more to hold people to account for results. That is how some other jurisdictions have gotten results. It's not just having a lot of fancy means of analyzing the data. It's how you put it to use to hold people to accountability. Like, look at the maps there. Those maps were generated by MITS, right? And outfit on campus. And that's St. James in the low point 2014. Look at St. James 3 years later, right? Now, that's really great work.
Where's St. James, Prof?
That's St. James, the parish.
But the colors represent what?
You see, the boundaries are St. James. The red is homicide, right? At a serious level. And then you have the orange there at lower levels of intensity of homicide.
Yes.
All of these crime maps are available, you know, right? There's a lot of work done on hotspot mapping and so forth. It's to put it to more effective use, as I said.
Yes.
Importantly, not just using it for strategy, using it to ensure accountability and getting results. So if your plans of work and your strategy are grounded in a realistic assessment, grounded in an understanding of the patterns, your targets are realistic because they are so grounded, then it's for the folks to hold people to account for the results.
Thank you, Prof. We've got 10 minutes to go. We've already extended the time because we find the information coming out to be very crucial. We do have a question from a member of the audience, and this may be for Dr. Damian King. Will the economic shock of Russian invasion be worse than the shock caused by COVID? I know you spoke of the imprecision in forecasting, but could you tell us whether you think this one will be worse than COVID?
It's unlikely. Some colleagues of mine who have an outfit called the Research Project did an analysis of the cost of every disaster that has happened in Jamaica. The economic and fiscal cost of every disaster in Jamaica, which essentially has been hurricanes, going all the way back 30 years. And the cost of the pandemic was 2.5 times greater than the worst natural disaster we have had, which was Gilbert.
In terms of billions of dollars?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh. What about in comparison to FinSac, for example?
So, well, no. FinSac was a loss of value. So that's not a comparable event.
Yes.
That was mostly a transfer of value from some people to others.
Okay.
But in terms of what it cost to sort of reconstruct, then this was by far, by a multiple, the worst economic disaster that hit the country since independence. It is highly unlikely that the implications of the war in Europe is going to have that cost.
The war as it is now, what if NATO is involved and it becomes a war in Europe, and then all of the repercussions from it? Yeah?
I mean, I don't have the expertise or the experience to be able to make a prognostication on where it can go militarily.
Yes.
So I can't say that that kind of escalation is not possible. But it would have to go on for a long time.
Yes.
And escalate greatly for the effects of it to reach Jamaica and have the kinds of consequences that the pandemic had.
Yes. Mr. Campbell, Courtney Campbell, President and CEO of VM Group. You have another question, another point?
No, not a question, a comment. I promised a comment on the banking fees.
Yes, thank you so much.
It has been,
how do you feel about that? I mean, the minister has not gone to cap your banking fees, but certainly he has done something that would probably cause people to have bank accounts and not have any fees charged on them. Your thoughts?
All good. But I think it has been topical, and the minister spent quite a bit of time on it yesterday.
Yes.
I think I wanted to underscore some points that the minister made yesterday, that in fact we have a very competitive banking sector with a diversity of business models. It's actually people in the players in the sector have different objectives. They have different business models. They make decisions because they are focused on different profit goals and so on. And I think what I would encourage the public to do, all our viewers this evening, I would encourage them all to invest the time in shopping around. Just probably identify 3 institutions. I would suggest VMB one, right? Unashamedly. And compare the fees.
Yes.
Ask people you know about the quality of service received from the institutions and make your decision. And then the only other thing is to invest a little time in actually opening the account, because that's sometimes a deterrent for people, but it's a one-time investment that we would ask you to make. Right?
One time, not one day?
No, not one day.
Thank God for
Not
that.
one day. And the truth is that, we're all in the industry trying to make that process easier and easier. So that, because we're all concerned about the convenience, that is experienced by our members. We call them at VM.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Can I have a thought from Larry Watson from JCC, CEO of Jamaica Chamber of Commerce, before we have to end the forum?
Yeah. When I heard Dr. King speaking of inflation and growth and the historical effects of inflation, and, just to say, I think over the last 40 years, our growth rate has averaged about 1%, thereabout, and the implications on crime. because I think in what you are articulating, Professor, we are of the belief that a lot of the crime come because there is no economic opportunity for the youth as they become adults. And, I just wanted to maybe ask Dr. King, to comment on that. And, as we look on inflation and look on growth and be looking ahead, how do you think those will intercept as we look to the future of Jamaica?
By and large, we should de-emphasize the link from lack of economic growth to crime. A casual glance at global data will reveal that Jamaica is a middle-income country. Half of the countries in the world are more well-off than Jamaica. The other half are poorer than Jamaica. And the half that are poorer than Jamaica don't have higher crime rates by and large. You can find one or two that are in our league. So that is not the primary driver of crime in terms of establishing correlations. Crime, as Professor Harriet can talk much more about than I am, has its own determinants and factors and drivers and occupies space that is left open to it by the structure of society. And so the causation is how crime holds back economic growth and not how poverty itself is driving crime.
We've got 3 minutes to go. Ian Nita will take a comment from you, and I'll also take a comment from Tamara Wall Douglas, Sales and Client Manager of VM Wealth before we end. Go ahead, Mr. Nita.
Thank you, Emily. Dr. Harriot, quickly, have you ever done any studies on the link between corporal punishment and the violence in the society? And secondly, the proliferation of theft in electricity in normalizing theft generally. Are there any links between these two phenomena?
Well, first on the business of corporal punishment, I spent my career studying adult criminality. And maybe not doing enough on what others have done very well, right? Which is to study impact of violence on children, including corporal punishment, and how that gets reproduced at later stages in the life course. Quite a bit of work done by others here in Jamaica on that. And we know that experience with violence as victim tends to lead to the reproduction of violence when power relations shift and you are now an adult and you have power over others. You exercise it in that way as a method of control, of getting what you want, and so forth. So yes, there's some documentation of that aspect of it. And there's a second part. Oh, the theft of electricity.
You have 20 seconds.
Yeah, well, the theft of electricity is a manifestation of a point I made earlier, that the problem has spread to large enough sections of the population, right? What percentage of electricity users are involved in theft? It's around 20%.
Wow.
Huh?
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
those were the numbers I saw. Am I right, Damien?
I don't know.
Yeah, I did see those numbers. Huh?
He doesn't participate in that. He doesn't have those data.
Okay, fine. But it's a large percentage of electricity users.
Right. I'm so sorry, Prof. I'm absolutely out of time. Last 10 seconds coming from Tamara Ward Douglas.
Hi, afternoon, everyone. I think the only thing that I'm not seeing us talk about this evening, and Professor Hickman, that's for you, on crime, I don't see us talking about the social implications. I see us talking a lot about the economic, but I think a lot of what is missing from our society right now is the home, the parent, the parenting. When you look at how desensitized we are to crime, that's so lacking. How do we go back to basics? How do we go back to, sorry?
Yes. How do we go back to basics?
How do we go back to basics?
I'm absolutely out of time, though. I hear Prof trying to come in. That's for next year.
Yeah. That's
Look
the
forward.
excluded middle that I spoke about.
That's the excluded middle.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we exclude the middle at the end. It has been my absolute pleasure having you for this Post-Budget Forum 2022. Thank you so much to VM Investments Limited, a subsidiary of the VM Group. Thank you to the team here at TVJ. Thank you for joining us on the various platforms. We look forward to having your company again next year as we continue to sift through some of the crucial issues affecting this country, matters of the economy, and matters of crime. Please have yourselves a good evening. Take care. I'm Emily Shields.
VM Investments and the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce has just presented Post-Budget Forum 2022.